Our next fallacy of illicit presumption is the loaded question, also known as complex question. Loaded questions are questions that contain a hidden presumption, usually disguised as a subordinate clause within a simple yes or no question, as in this famous example. Have you stopped beating your wife yet? Since this is a yes or no question, no matter how you respond, you have to admit to beating your wife. If your answer is no, then it sounds like you're continuing to beat your wife. If your answer is yes, then you admit to beating your wife in the past. Either way, you're a wife beater. The question itself presumes the truth of the claim, and that's what makes it loaded. Students of political science will quickly recognize another use for loaded questions, the so-called push poll. In a normal opinion poll, people are asked their beliefs about current issues. In a push poll, callers pretend to be conducting an opinion poll, but aren't really interested in your views. Instead, they want to influence your beliefs and usually convince you to vote in a certain way. A very insidious but effective way to do that is to pose a loaded question, as in this famous example of a push poll conducted in South Carolina during the Republican presidential primary in 2000, where John McCain was opposing George W. Bush to be the Republican nominee. In the push poll, voters were asked, would you be more or less likely to vote for John McCain if you knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child? At the time, McCain was campaigning with his adopted daughter from Bangladesh. Apparently, the push poll and its loaded question worked well. Bush won in South Carolina. Our next fallacy, the fallacy of false choice, is known by many other names. The either-or fallacy, false dichotomy, the black and white fallacy, and false dilemma. Regardless of its name, it is a logical fallacy that keeps people from considering the full range of relevant possibilities. Typically, this involves presenting an issue as if there are two, and only two, possible courses of action, one of which is unappealing for practical or personal reasons, which forces one to choose the remaining option. The problem is that the options presented do not exhaust the range of possible choices, since there are additional options that are not presented. The problem is often compounded because the choices are also not exclusive, which means that they don't rule each other out, so we don't really have to choose between them. They could peacefully coexist. Here's a video from Kevin Delaplante that explains the logical structure of the fallacy.
You're given two options and told that you should certainly reject one of them, so you're forced to accept the remaining option. This is a fallacy when the options you're given don't include all the real options. Here's an example. He's either voting Democrat or Republican. He's not voting Republican, therefore he must be voting Democrat. Now, looking at this in purely logical terms, there's nothing wrong with this argument. This is called disjunctive syllogism. The problem here isn't with the logic. The problem is with the assumption that the only two options are voting Democrat or Republican. Maybe his dad is going to vote for the Green candidate, or the Libertarian candidate, or maybe he'll decide not to vote at all. There are lots of other possibilities. So the problem is with the truth of that first premise. It sets up a false dilemma, or a false dichotomy. Either A is true or B is true. There's no third option, but there are other options. Here's a pretty common argument about God and evolution that you may have encountered. Either you believe in God, or you believe in evolution. They can't both be true. Well, I believe in God, so I have to reject evolution. Before we talk about the plausibility of that first premise, let me make a note about the logical form being used. You get the form on the left when you assert that A or B must be true, and then deny one of the disjuncts, which allows you to infer that the remaining disjunct must be true. This is a valid argument form. Now, our example above doesn't have this form. In premise 2, we're affirming one of the disjuncts and using this to infer that the remaining disjunct must be false. But we know that this argument form isn't valid if the or is an inclusive or. That's the case we're describing in the middle. It's only valid if the or is an exclusive or. That's the case on the right. To say that the or is inclusive is to say that it's possible that A and B could both be true, that it includes this possibility. With an exclusive or, you're excluding this possibility. You're saying that either A is true or B is true, but they're mutually exclusive. They can't both be true. Should we treat this argument about God and evolution as making an exclusive or claim or an inclusive or claim? It's important because if it's an exclusive or claim, then the argument as given is valid, but if it's an inclusive or, then the argument is invalid. In this case, it's not too hard to see that the arguer is intending this as an exclusive or. Key phrase is, you can't have it both ways. So we're looking at an argument that is intended to function like the valid form on the right. So on this reading, the argument is valid and it satisfies the logic condition. The only question that remains is whether it satisfies the truth condition, whether that exclusive or disjunctive premise is plausible or not. One of the most common forms of the fallacy occurs when a choice is presented that really represents the two ends of a continuum of possibilities. For example, when someone says, either you support minimal government and free markets or you're a socialist. This setup ignores the range of intermediate possibilities between these two poles, such as the various forms of classical welfare liberalism that try to strike a balance between libertarianism and socialism. When false dilemmas show up in this form, it's sometimes called the fallacy of black and white thinking, for obvious reasons. It sets up a choice in terms of stark contrasts and ignores the various shades of gray that might exist in between. This is, I think, the most common and worrisome form of the false dilemma fallacy. Unfortunately, because the fallacy isn't a purely logical one, diagnosing it requires that you actually know something about the subject matter, and that's not something that can be taught in a logic class.
For an example of false choice, here's George W. Bush committing a memorable instance of the fallacy.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
And here's Bush's successor presenting another false choice.
Both parties agree that we need to reduce the deficit by the same amount, by $4 trillion. So what choices are we going to make to reach that goal? Either we ask the wealthiest Americans to pay their fair share in taxes, or we're going to have to ask seniors to pay more for Medicare. We can't afford to do both.